My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you're here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask your pardon for my sins and grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Mother Immaculate, St. Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. Jesus, an issue comes up in the Gospel today that a lot of people have a lot of struggles with. That is the whole question of purity. Now, the question is, whenever the disciples are walking through the marketplace, whether they are doing something which is impure. They are seen by the Pharisees to be eating with their hands, having not purified them, and they are accused of having unclean hands. And just reflecting on this whole question of being unclean comes, at least in my mind, to the whole question of purity. Now, I don't know what you think of when you think of the word unclean or declaring something to be unclean, but I think it can have two senses. First of all, something can be physically unclean. You know, we see something which is dirty, which has, I don't know, you've put food all over it, all over a tablecloth or a piece of silver that has become tarnished. It is unclean, and it requires that something else has to come to purify it, to clean it, and in a sense to restore it to the state which it should be originally. But there can also be a sense of moral uncleanness. Sometimes whenever we have experience of our sinfulness, particularly, let's say, with sins of impurity, people often express that a feeling of being unclean. And so whenever the disciples are accused of being unclean, it's something which can resound within us, Jesus, in both senses. Physical uncleanness, but also in moral uncleanness. Now, it's actually quite clear that what's being described here is a different type of unclean. It's a kind of unclean which is ritually unclean. There are two words that can express the kind of sense of being unclean in Greek, in the Gospel, in the New Testament, koinos, which can be translated, as it is here in today's Gospel, as unclean, but it just means common. Or we can also come across the word akathartos, which means unclean in the sense of those who are suffering from an unclean spirit, or those who are suffering from a demon. It's a different kind of uncleanness, so to speak. Now, what of that first type, of the kind of ritual uncleanliness? Well, in that sense, what happens is that you could make something clean again by a ritual act. So by, in the most common sense, taking pots or pans or whatever it is that's being used for cooking, in order that they are ritually clean, that they would have to be kind of bathed in naturally running water and accompanied by a prayer. And it's the exact same thing that the disciples are accused of, therefore, in the Gospel, of being unclean because they have not washed their hands coming from the marketplace. So in a sense, they are seen as being ritually unclean. They haven't performed the standard rituals which would have declared them clean, in other words. And that whole notion of ritual impurity doesn't really touch upon the question of being morally impure. Because if something is ritually impure, all it has to be done is to perform a ceremony, to perform a ritual, sure, with a sincere heart, but purely by the act of the ritual itself, and through the prayer, that thing becomes, or that person becomes, ritually pure. But it's not so easy, in a sense, whenever we're talking about a spiritual uncleanness. Think of those that are really suffering under unclean spirits. And perhaps most commonly for us, when we experience a lack of purity, let's say through our sinfulness, then we cannot just simply say a little prayer and that sin will go away, but we require a cleansing which only God can give. We require a purification which is the gift of God. So let's say most commonly we could maybe understand this sense of being ritually unclean if you buy something that is for personal devotion, and you might say a pair of rosary beads and take that to a priest to get that blessed beforehand. In a sense, the blessing makes that object holy because it's set aside through that prayer of blessing for that particular purpose. But it doesn't affect, let's say, the nature of that object in any way. Whereas if we have committed sins, we need to go to confession in order for that sin to be purified by the grace of God. So what's really being dealt with here in the gospel today is the whole question of ritual impurity. But what really affects us more is that moral impurity. Because we don't just want to have things that are nice and neat, or things that are pure objects that we can use for our devotion, but we want to have a pure heart in order to praise you, Jesus. And we're conscious that there's a lot of people that struggle with the whole concept of purity, that struggle to have that grace and that gift that you want for each one of us. And we hold them in our prayer in this moment, Jesus, that those who are struggling with purity at this time will be experiencing a great renewal in grace, to be strengthened by the whole church praying for them, that they might truly know what it is to pray with a pure heart. And it is that higher virtue to which we all attain, with our weaknesses, Jesus, but we're looking to you, the one who is pure, to raise us up from all types of impurity, in order that we can really praise you with a pure heart. Now, we sometimes experience sinfulness, let's say, in different moments. So we can start off walking down the road and it begins to get a little bit more difficult for us, and perhaps we're experiencing temptation in a more vivid way. Now, at any stage we could turn round, but temptation being what temptation is, often we don't. And we lack sometimes the courage or the fortitude or the strength, or whatever it is, to turn around in our tracks. And we continue on a path which doesn't lead us towards you, Jesus, but leads us, in fact, in the other direction. And it's those, let's say, those threshold moments of being between and betwixt committing a sin, where we really need that grace and that support. And it's all those moments of grace that we build up outside of that moment that actually help us and strengthen us then most of all. That is to say, that all the times that we spend in prayer, they nourish our souls and they protect us and strengthen us for the moment whenever we are going to be put to the test, or whenever sinfulness becomes far more of a problem for us, so to speak. And it's that desire for purity of heart that should help us in that moment, that we should be sufficiently strengthened by prayer and by grace, so that when we face temptation, or to put it back to the analogy, when we're walking down that road and we realize we're going the wrong direction, that we just stop and we turn around, or we go in a completely different direction that's going to take us away from the sinful end and back towards you, Jesus. And it's those threshold moments that often that we can experience the greatest challenge. But it's also sometimes those threshold moments that when we look back upon it, are the moments whenever we needed the most help that we didn't get, or we didn't, let's say, apply the right help in the moment that we needed, which is your grace, Jesus. And then when people fall into sin, often experience that sense of being unclean or being impure. Well, when that happens, Jesus, you pick us up through the sacrament of confession. Of course we fail, nobody is perfect. And that sense of impurity is a sense of having fallen away from you, Jesus. But the sense of purity is the one of being united to you. Now today there is a beautiful example of a saint set before us. That is Saint Josephine Bakita, a beautiful African saint. As a young girl, she was kidnapped from her village in Sudan, and she was sold into a life of slavery where she suffered really tremendously over a long period of time. So much so that she even forgot what her original name was. She was passed from one slave owner to the next, where she was treated absolutely abominably, until she finally ended up in Europe, where she was given as a gift from one family to another in Italy in order to be nanny of the children. And it was whenever she was looking after these little children that she came to know of you, Jesus, through the catechism classes that the little girl who she was looking after was attending. And coming to know you, Jesus, she came to know true freedom and true peace. And she asked to be baptized and eventually entered the convent where she lived for the rest of her life, dying in 1947. Now there was a truly pure heart who lived in freedom, not because she was no longer a slave, but because she was truly free through the grace that you had given her, Jesus. pray for us, St. Josephine Bakhita, that we too might be strengthened by the grace of God, to be freed from all of the sinfulness and all of the slaveries that we subject upon ourselves, in order that we might truly live as the children of God. I give you thanks, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations that you have communicated to me during this meditation. I ask your help to put them into effect. My Mother Immaculate, St. Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.